Welcome to the Moscow.
Добро пожаловать на...
It's my pleasure to welcome you to the evening keynote speech. We're honored to have Carolyn Steel with us, best-selling author, and she will be talking about Sitopia, transforming cities through food. My name is Ksenia Jube, and I'm director of Adjube Scott Whitby Studio, and I will be moderating this session. Now, please submit your questions. We're looking for questions from the audience. You can do so just underneath the video. We will pose them to Carolyn after her talk. It's a pleasure to introduce Carolyn Steel, is a leading thinker on food and cities, an architect and academic based in London. She's the author of 2 best-selling books, Hungry City, How Food Shapes Our Lives, and more recently, Sitopia, How Food Can Save the World, published in 2020. And these books have received non-fiction awards. They've been incredibly influential worldwide on designers, urban governments, thinkers, farmers. Her concept of Sitopia, or food place, from the Greek sitos, food, and topos, place, has been incredibly influential, also in fields of ecology, academia, and the arts. Carolyn studied architecture at Cambridge University and subsequently taught there. She's taught at London Metropolitan, Wageningen Universities, and at London School of Economics. And she is the inaugural studio director of the Cities programme. She is also director of Kilburn Nightingale Architects in London and collaborates with cities and institutions across the world. We're incredibly lucky and honoured to have Carolyn speak this evening because she's been called a 21st century visionary and has presented these ideas extensively. So we really look forward to hearing your presentation, Carolyn, and perhaps discussing it further afterwards. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Xenia. It's a great pleasure to join you in Moscow. Thank you so much for inviting me. Yes, I'm beginning with a slightly kind of dramatic looking slide. We live in perilous times, as I don't have to tell you, and we face ecological challenges of unprecedented proportions, everything from climate change to the global pandemic that's currently making our lives incredibly difficult. So the question of how can we deal with all of these issues without basically losing our minds, because they're also enormous, clearly arises. And I would like to propose to you that we can do this through food. This is the book that Xenia kindly mentioned in her introduction. It came out actually last year in the same week that the pandemic was declared, which was slightly weird timing. But interestingly, in it, I talk about how pandemics are likely because we have a sort of a very out of kilter relationship with food. And indeed, while writing the book, I was looking at all of these different issues that we face, as I say, and saying, well, they can all be connected by food because we live in a world shaped by food. And again, as Xenia briefly mentioned in her introduction, this is a word I invented about 15 years ago, Sitopia. It just means food place, from the Greek sitos for food and topos for place. And it's a kind of food-based alternative to utopia. In other words, we live in a world shaped by food, but we don't value food, and that means we live in a bad Sitopia. And I'm actually going to show you a slightly embarrassing drawing, which is a kind of slightly posher version of the drawing that I did, out of which the book came. And again, the original drawing I did about 10 years ago now. But I was trying to work out where food sits in our world. And of course, we all eat, so we all know what it is to sit down at the table and eat a delicious plate of food. And of course, in that act of sharing, we sort of bond with each other, we sort of define who we are in a group, in a family, and so on. And often somebody else has cooked the food for us. So there's a figure over here, it might be our mum or our dad, it could just be anybody, but food has been cooked for us, so we're being nurtured and cared for. And, you know, if you're lucky, that we're sort of we're grateful for this, and there's some kind of reception and gratitude going the other way. And this really becomes, by definition, the sort of the space of where we feel we belong, the space of the home. But then, of course, the food didn't come from our home usually. It often came from somewhere else. So where was that place? And I just call this place loosely the market, of course. It's often not a sort of cozy little market with people you can talk to anymore. It could just be a sort of, if you like, the economic system, or it could be a supermarket or whatever. But of course, the cook got their food from the market. So again, we have another exchange system going here of money, of trust, of connection, and that really becomes the primary space of the economy. And then there's a question of where the market sits, and that, of course, sits in the city. Where does the city sit? In the countryside. Where does the countryside sit? Well, in a place we kind of loosely call nature, although, of course, all of this sits within nature, actually. And where does all that sit? Well, we live on a big rotating planet, so it belongs in the universe. And, of course, this brings in the element of seasons and time and so on. And if you turn this drawing on its side, that actually is the structure of my book. It goes from food to the body, the home, society, city and country, nature and time. Those are the chapters in my book. Now, as I say, we live in this incredibly complex, interconnected world. But without food, it simply wouldn't exist, and we wouldn't exist because we have to eat in order to live. So it's quite interesting that we've forgotten the true value of food. Of course, historically, this wasn't the case. In the past, people were much more aware of the importance of food, partly because actually it was a lot harder for the average person to get hold of any. And it's quite interesting to me. I mean, this is actually my favourite image of what I call Sitopia, which is a kind of idealised, in a way, food-based world. And some of you might know this image. It's Ambrogio Lorenzetti's Allegory of the Effects of Good Government, painted in the 14th century. It actually sits on one wall of the town hall in Siena, a beautiful room where you actually look out onto a landscape that still looks very much like the one in this image, which has been, if you like, sort of modified in order to feed the city. So it's got olive groves, it's got fields, it's got vineyards and so on. And coming through this very sort of dominant feature of the city wall through the gate is all of these creatures who you actually see are also to do with food. So you've got asses bringing in grain on their backs, you've got a pig walking into market, you've got hunters leaving, and then inside the city as well, flocks of sheep wandering around, a woman with a basket of eggs on her head or carrying a chicken. So what you see, what this image is really telling you is that the allegory of the effects of good government, which is an important thing to remember, this is actually about politics, is to maintain this incredibly fruitful, powerful relationship between the city and the countryside, and to keep them in balance. And it's a very unusual image because it does, as it were, you know, give the countryside equal billing to the city. Of course, as we know today, you can't generally look out of your window and see the landscape that feeds you. It's often many hundreds or even thousands of miles away. And of course, you know, the balance between the city and the countryside is no longer one of harmony in the same way that it was in that image of the 14th century Italian city-state. So many of us now live in cities, and we're very sort of distanced, both mentally and physically, from the landscapes that feed us. And I call this the urban paradox. And the urban paradox is really the idea that even though most of us now live in cities globally and we think of ourselves as urban and talk of ourselves as urban, we're still animals and we still need food, and that food comes from somewhere else. So I think there's a very strong argument to say that actually, in a more profound sense, we still dwell in a place you might call the countryside, or the productive hinterland that we can't see. Now, actually, this is not a new idea. both Plato and Aristotle, that's actually Aristotle you're looking at there, they worried. They were probably the first people in the world to kind of worry directly about the question of how you feed a city. And I love this term that Aristotle came up with. He called us political animals, humans. And this sort of speaks of an inherent duality that we have, because on the one hand, we're political, which means we need to be in society. But on the other hand, we're animals, which means we need nature. So he really sort of struggled with the idea of how do you bring these two things together? And that's in a way that a space that attempted to do that, the Athenian Agora, which was, as you probably know, Athens's food market. And he came up with this idea of economia, which is basically, it's from the Greek, ekos for household and nemein to manage. So household management. So what does that actually mean? Well, it means that, and in fact, both Plato and Aristotle thought this was the ideal arrangement for the polis or city-state, was that every citizen would have a house in the city and a farm in the countryside from which to feed it. So the household itself was self-sufficient. And they argued that, if that was the case for every citizen, then the city itself would be self-sufficient. And that is the basis of economia, that essentially the city is able to feed itself from its own territories. And interestingly, they both thought, in order to maintain this ideal relationship, the city should remain small, because if it got too big, there simply wouldn't be enough land outside it to have this kind of reciprocal arrangement. That's quite ironic. I mean, if this word looks familiar, it's because actually it's the basis of our modern word in English, economics. And of course, modern economics are, might say, almost the exact opposite of this, because instead of trying to maintain a balance between the city and the country, the city has kind of exploited the countryside to within an inch of its life. Actually, the polis, or the city-state, was an incredibly effective model, and most ancient cities adopted it. And I should have said, I've cut out a lot of slides to fit into my 20 minutes, but I should have said that cities and agriculture co-evolved through basically the discovery of grain as a food source. So grain is the most important food of cities, and most were small, and they were surrounded by farmland in that kind of way that I've just shown you Athens also was. But of course, when Rome came along, it completely bucked the trend. It went in a very different direction. This is actually Rome's market area here. But you can see that the city's far too big. It actually had 1 million citizens, amazingly, by the 1st century AD. So it would have been far too big to have just fed from its local territories. And indeed, it didn't do that. It went totally the opposite way. It invented what we now call food miles, which is the idea that you basically get in a ship and you kind of conquer neighbouring lands and you start to import your food from there. So indeed, Rome conquered Sicily, Sardinia, Carthage, and then Egypt very famously, all very, very good grain-producing regions, and it was able to import its food by sea. It was actually about 40 times cheaper to move food over the sea than over land in the ancient world, which is basically how Rome was able to do this. And of course, it wasn't just importing grain, it was also importing wine and pork and oil and liquamen, which is a fermented fish sauce that Romans were slightly obsessed with. So Rome is fascinating because it's actually the first city to totally outgrow its local hinterland. And, to show really that, the sort of the model that, if you like, we now follow in the industrial world, which is that the city doesn't feed itself at all. It just imports its food from wherever it can get it. Interestingly, Romans themselves thought this was rather a decadent setup and lamented the fact that, as the poet Martial put it, Rome used to grow its own grain and import roses from Egypt, and now all that Rome grew was roses and all its bread came from Egypt. So he saw, and many Romans saw, this kind of fact that the city couldn't feed itself as a sort of form of decadence. And of course, the bigger picture was that actually these bread baskets, having been mercilessly sort of having all the nutrients sucked out of them for several hundred years, they began to fail. And in fact, the empire which grew actually, grew bigger and bigger, partly being driven by this need to constantly find new territories that could feed the city, eventually collapsed on itself. Now, I've put in, I'm not an expert on Rome's foodways by any means whatsoever, but I just found this map and I thought it was, sorry, Moscow's, I mean, not Rome's. I know quite a lot about Rome. But Moscow, I just found this map and I just found it absolutely fascinating because, as you can see, the city wall is out here. You know, the central city is here, and then there's this basically protected food-producing regions within the city. And this would have been very normal, actually, in early modern cities. This idea that, you know, I mean, famously, a way to defeat a city was to stop its food supply from coming in. So many cities were actually, they did practice a form of economia. They did grow a lot of their own food, and of course, pigs and chickens were often kept in the city itself, because they could be fed up on kitchen scraps as well. So the pre-industrial city was actually a sort of a productive microcosm, which we often forget, I think. And of course, food played a big part in the social and political life of the city too. So again, I found this image of Red Square in the early 19th century. And you can see it's working as a food market, but you can see people are also just coming here to sort of just to hang out, to chat and so on. And of course you have, you know, the religious building overlooking the square and also the Kremlin, so the political building. So you get this classic sort of triad that you find in virtually every city in the world, which is the commerce of the market in the centre of the city, the house of God kind of bringing it all into spiritual order, and the political building establishment sort of overseeing everything. And this remains a very powerful triad up until this moment, which is the coming of the railways. And I call this slide Goodbye Geography because really sort of fundamental things change. Three key things, I would say, change when the railways come. I mean, obviously what the railways make it possible to do for the first time is to transport food over long distances rapidly. So this liberates cities from geography because they're no longer constrained as to how big they can grow by the size of their hinterland or their access to the sea. So actually they can grow any size, any shape and place they want. The second thing is that politicians who up till that point had been at least partly in charge of the food supply, in some places more than others, they give over responsibility for feeding their people to the new food industries. And last but not least, food, which has been very visible in the city, it's actually kind of travelled in and sitting in the physical market in the open space, becomes invisible because it starts to travel down specialist food logistics routes that the ordinary city dweller can't see. So we see these consequences as the urban age really starts to get underway. And of course, it's not only cities that begin to expand very rapidly, but also their productive hinterlands. So the most radical transformation happened in the New World, where vast areas like this was the American Great West, so-called, which was inhabited by Native Americans and tens of millions of bison. It was grassland. The bison was slaughtered from the backs of trains. The Native Americans moved off to reservations. And the largest monocultural grain production ever seen was established. And actually, this is really the beginning of the industrial food system because people in Chicago came up with the bright idea of feeding the excess grain, because there's actually more grain than people could eat, feeding it to cattle. So we get the invention of cheap food, cheap meat, which is then transported in chill chains, so chilled railway trucks to the East Coast, and we get the beginning of the food industry really taking over responsibility for feeding people. And all sorts of things to be said about that, but in my 20 minutes, I'm just going to move on to, obviously, the next very key transformation of cities, which obviously comes with the motor car. So we start, if we've begun with these kind of very, very tight cities, the city-states surrounded by countryside, we now get actually cities sprawling over all the best farmland, because, of course, suburbs are always... cities were originally founded in places where they could feed themselves. So when the suburbs occur, it's usually over the best farmland. And, you know, instead of moving into the city centre to buy your food, people now drive out of the city to go to this refrigerated box called a supermarket, where they wander around in sort of eternal springtime in air conditioning. And of course, food is now getting denatured because it's travelling down all these kind of crazy logistical pathways. So it's often processed and packaged. And our relationship with it becomes incredibly distant and also very wasteful because we don't really know what we're dealing with anymore. Now, as I said briefly earlier, we've created a world predicated on the existence of a thing called cheap food, but it's actually an illusion. So if you look at some of the externalities of the way we produce food now, they're horrendous. So we have about a third of global cropland that's either lost or degraded because of this kind of monocultural farming. About 30% of global greenhouse gas emissions are the direct result of the food system and farming and agriculture, industrial agriculture, particularly deforestation for livestock production. We're using about 70% of available freshwater in farming, a lot of that from non-renewable resources. Of course, we have obesity and diet-related disease. Of course, we have our friend COVID, which is actually also the result of the loss of biodiversity and our habitats that's making it easier for pandemics to make the leap into our world. Viruses, I should say. Huge amounts of waste because we don't value food, so that all of that delicious food is actually from the supermarket dumpster or waste bin. We're feeding about a third of the grain we produce globally to animals, which is an incredibly wasteful way of feeding ourselves because we could feed 10 times as many people if we just ate the meat directly, ate the grain directly. We're spending about 10 calories of energy for every calorie of food we consume. And there's a huge decline in bird and insect life, and we are entering a sixth mass extinction, and that's to do with all the chemicals and pesticides and so on that we're chucking on the ground. So it's a bit of a catastrophe, but really worryingly, this kind of food model is going global because there's a huge amount of money to be made from it in treating nature as if it came for free, as if it's expendable, and of course selling people highly branded, highly processed food. So we're in a crisis. So what are we going to do about it? Well, you know, one sort of my first crumb of comfort to offer you is that this is not a new question. As I just mentioned, the Greeks already worried about how to feed a city. Thomas More in the 16th century, he sort of was worried about how greedy London was, and he wrote a book, Utopia, basically sort of saying we need to go back to the city-state model. And Ebenezer Howard's Garden Cities, written in the early 20th century, is really sort of Thomas More with railways. It's basically going back to the polis and sort of going back to a local economy and limiting the size of the city. And of course, you know, the question here is really, what is a good life? How do we want to live? So I think what I've discovered after nearly 20 years of trying to see the world through the lens of food is that you can't disassociate the question of how to eat with the question of how to live. They're really two halves of the same question. They're like this. So, you know, we have choices. If we are going to eat meat, are we going to allow cows to eat grass, which is basically what they evolved to do, and this is why we co-evolved with them, by the way, or are we going to feed them grain? That's a so-called concentrated animal feeding operation, which is where hundreds of thousands of cattle are gathered together and they're fed on grain and they're full of antibiotics because actually eating grain makes them sick. Do we walk into the centre of a city and meet people anymore? So do we sort of rejuvenate that sort of the ancient society of the market? Or do we leave the city in the name of convenience, or indeed just dial up a curry on our phone into in the morning or from Deliveroo or someone? Do we sit around a table and enjoy the company of one another as we evolved as a species to do? You know, we learnt how to speak and how to share through the shared meal, or are we too busy to eat? So again, my favourite pre-pandemic statistic was that 1 in 5 meals in America was being eaten in a car. So which of these relationships with food do we think is actually bringing us a better life? Now, of course, COVID's thrown a whole other set of issues at us, which all relate directly into the sorts of questions I've just been asking. This was India during the first lockdown, 47 million Indians who were actually working in cities that wasn't their real home. Their real home was back in the village. So there was this mass migration, which is, sort of hundreds of people died on it because the government did nothing to help them get back home. So there was a sort of real imbalance there that was exposed. Of course, all over Europe, we're seeing the closure of shops. I mean, this is particularly in the UK, actually, because we're obsessed with buying things online anyway, and COVID's just exaggerated that. There's this question of working from home. Is that going to be part of the future, and is it really good for us or not? And, of course, the unemployment that COVID is inevitably going to bring. So all of these additional questions we have to answer now. To me, food is the answer, because I think food is what brings the two necessary sides of our lives together. So society, on the one hand, food connects us. It is the thing that brings us together and through which we evolve to sort of collaborate and work together as a society. And on the other hand, nature, because of course food is our direct connection to the natural world. So as I said, I mean, the market, or what it represents, the exchange and the sharing of food, to me really is the sort of the core of where this good life that we can live in future that is less damaging to the planet might come from. Of course, it means valuing food, and it's very ironic that it's often in a crisis that people do that. So this is London in the Second World War. This is Cuba after the fall of the Soviet Union, when it had to start to feed itself, having relied previously on the Soviet Union for its food. This is Detroit after the motor cars left, and people in all three cases started growing food again, but not only growing food, but sharing food and building up new social networks through it. So it's a kind of rejoining or reconnection of the producers and the consumers, only sometimes because they become the same person. But this was a study that was done of 6 countries in Europe, and basically they found that all the farmers and all the consumers in that country, their relationship was controlled monopolistically, really, by just 110 supermarket buyers. So really, I believe we need to move to a system that looks more like this, where the producers and the consumers join one another directly. Yes, supermarkets will still exist, but their power will be reduced. So what does that look like? Well, I mean, as I keep saying, food brings us together in so many ways that we might even overlook because it's so natural to us. So everything from that family meal to markets and cities, to farmers' cooperatives, to places where we might go out and eat, but actually are run by small-scale family businesses. And of course, with nature, I mean, I think it's very clear that we can't keep on farming in the way that we do because it's destroying the planet. Luckily, there are many very wonderful and exciting examples of how we can farm better with nature. Everything from not tilling the soil, working with the soil and working with complexity and natural ecosystems that do include animals, by the way, such as mob grazing. And of course, bringing food, which I guess is the thing that's most directly related to the topic of the Urban Forum right now. Sort of how can we bring food back to the centre of our planning and our thinking? So I actually find the Russian Bachelor an incredibly inspiring model, because it is actually, I mean, I read somewhere recently that 40% of the food in Russia is produced by people themselves in dachas, which staggered me, actually. But it's a wonderful model. I love it. And it brings society and nature together and re-establishes a kind of very positive relationship to the inner city and its countryside. But it's also incorporating food in governance, as they've done in Toronto. It's looking at the inherent productivity of a city region. It's protecting infrastructure, vital infrastructure like local abattoirs, making space for food in the city, for example, through farmers' markets. And of course, if we value food, all of these things generate wonderful spaces, wonderful jobs. It sort of becomes, the fact that we've got to eat becomes a kind of a positive feedback loop rather than a negative one.
Carolyn, we have 1 minute remaining, if you'd like.
Okay. And then, so what I'm really talking about is creating landscapes for human and non-human flourishing. And here's some examples: urban farming in New York, incorporating food in new city plans, and urban food centres as in Antwerp. So that's it. If you want to know more about why we should value food, that's my book. And I really believe by valuing food, we can build a better world. thank you very much for listening.
Wow, thank you. That was absolutely wonderful. And is the book translated into Russian yet, or do we have to do that?
I think I think the organisers, in fact, of the forum are planning to bring it out in Russian, which is very exciting.
Amazing. Well, we really look forward to offering it to the Russian-speaking audience. I loved your talk. Thank you so much. So much relevance, I think, for Moscow and this idea of the potential of the crisis and these awful ecological crises that also will be faced by northern ecosystems and really vast changes to northern ecosystems, such as in Russia, that perhaps will force, as you say, a rethinking of our relationship with food and these new practices of agroforestry and forest gardens, which I think are very fitting to Russian culture and the way that nature is viewed, actually, so would come very naturally. And although we have run out of time, I can't help but pose just one short question to you, whether you see urban agriculture as something that could be done within inner city Moscow and how that might work.
Yeah, you can do it anywhere. I mean, I grow actually tomatoes and enormous pickling cucumbers on the way up to my central London flat on a tiny roof space, about 2 meters by 4 meters. So yeah, you can do it anywhere. It's amazing how much food you can grow in a really tiny space. And actually, if you do grow food, your connection with food and what it means really changes in a wonderful way. And you start to think like a farmer, and then you start to be a better consumer of food as well, because you understand what it takes to feed us all. So I think that's a really positive thing. And absolutely, you can do it in Moscow. You can do it anywhere.
Well, let's hope that transformation comes about and we can urbanize dachas and ruralize the urban population by doing so. It's been a really inspiring talk. Carolyn, thank you so much for joining us, and come to Moscow soon.
Love to. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Goodbye. And thank you to our audience for joining us and for watching us today. It's been a pleasure. Goodbye.